Welcome to Take 15 of the Unedited series, where we strive to live more boldly, more courageously, to live a life that is unedited, where you show up as more of your authentic self in a world that applauds inauthentic expression and majority thinking. I'm your host, Rontiade Benson Idahosa. I'm a peacemaking light worker, a lover of justice, and on this episode, we are addressing one of the weapons of our warfare: competition. Gang. You see, it was the very first way I was taught to prove my inherent worthiness, and those who were first in school were applauded for the possibility that they would eventually be first in life. And so even when I came second or third in a class of 50 students, you see, that simply wasn't good enough, because the person who came first was really the only person that deserved the acclaim, the trophy, the applause. After all, they didn't have two heads, did they? How many of you remember that? And so I clawed my way into silencing those voices that repeatedly compared me to my model older brother, that told me that my achievements didn't matter unless I came first. That demand to overachieve is why I often feel like I had no say in what I would do for a living, right? It was either law or medicine. These were two careers that neither of my parents had, at the time, the opportunity to acquire for themselves. And so we became their validation, right? Our first became their first. And so I now look back on that experience with compassion, but also with the recognition that it made my parents proud of something that they valued, that had eluded them, but had nonetheless somehow been conquered by someone that they guided into quote unquote greatness. You see, truth be told, at my core, I was and I remain a sensitive little girl who would apparently tell my mother that I wanted to cry at the drop of a hat. And so I was assigned a seat on the staircase to do just that. You see, it was there that I would daydream, I would write, I would tell my own stories, I would invent, I would curate. It was also there that I learned that my hands could heal. But I also quickly learned that those attributes, they were actually relegated to quote unquote underachievers, right? And so to prepare me for war, to prepare me for battle, I was also often disciplined by my grandmother for walking with my chest out, for crying, or for eating too much. Perhaps her own obesity perpetually reflected in my eyes, annoyed and then shamed her, right? Because that cane was never far out of reach. You see, my younger sisters also often teased me to the point of tears. And so when I would run to my mother for comfort, she would flippantly admonish me to harden up, because after all, Ronti Ade, kilo de, you are the older sister, Jare. Oh yeah, okay, go and cry. And so I armored up and became one of them, right? An overachiever that could not be relegated to the trenches of second, God forbid, because even though it wasn't who I was, it was who I became. And so with sword and shield in hand, I became a tomboy, right? Who fought boys physically. I would fight boys for calling my ebony ugly or fat. And perhaps it was why I rudely talked back to adults when their logic paled in comparison, right, to what my childhood sense was. It was why I would dismissively just fly my collar in primary 5, and I pierced my ears until I had no more space for needles. Perhaps it was also why the pages of library books were literally imprinted on my face. It was why I studied twice as hard, so I wouldn't be called Shalamahoy, which is a name that my father just made up, when he was angry, or have to endure the rage that accompanied the infamous Nigerian, you know what you're doing? Wow. Well, it's certainly why the only C on my uni transcript still taunts me, right? It's why, becoming valedictorian in my law school was so important to achieve for someone who wasn't even alive to witness it. You see, my father had transitioned at that point. But to this day, that law degree, it still lies encircled by cobwebs underneath my mother's bed, as it has for the last few decades, since the first and last day I laid eyes on it in 1999. You see, ironically, she never actually ever hung up what I thought was going to be her trophy. And so to this day, I still hear those voices, right? They're why my breastplate is often marred by scars, right? It's why I continue to fight so hard, particularly for the underdog. They're why I strive to elude the quote unquote L of defeat. So much so that nothing has to fight hard for me because, like the walls of Jericho, my persistence has already leveled it. You see, I'm afraid sometimes, right? I used to be afraid to give up this facade that has laced its tracks throughout my adulthood, that has made me vividly cognizant of the import of of ancestral trauma. But who and what emerges if I lose? Perhaps we can consider that reframe, who and what emerges if I lose? You see, once I recognize, right, that my innate worthiness is tied not to the external forces that shaped my childhood, but to my identity as an image bearer, as divinity, I am then obliged to decrease their volume, right, to relinquish the primitive weapons I picked up to protect my soul. And for the first time, I'm alone in the arena. And so I graciously now embrace the idiosyncrasies of that little girl that sought vulnerability over perfection, that cried over humanity's brokenness, that courageously leaned into radical self-love, self-acceptance, and miraculously, even at my age now, still beckons for me by name. Those are my thoughts of the day. Do with them as you will. Blessings.